Welcome to the first lesson of Intro to Functional Swift. In this lesson, you will learn what makes Clojure different from normal Swift functions. If you never learned and used Clojure before, this lesson can be a little tough for you. But regardless, let's get started. Hello everyone, welcome to Intro to Functional Swift with Bob the Developer. Today let's talk about closures. Who are you, closures? Something look like this. Okay, why do we use them? And what the heck do we care about this? Well, let me give you a little, let me share a story of mine. When I first learned Swift, I didn't know what Clojure is. I struggled so much, and I thought at one point when I had to learn how to build an app, I wanted to give up because of closures. Alright, this section can be tough for those who are not familiar with closures, but slowly we'll get there. And you got all the resources available. You got me on Slack, on Udemy. You got the resource page, the lecture notes. You got the source code. You got the internet. So if you get stuck, just ask and I'll be right there for you guys. Anyway, let's talk about closures. Clojure is a function without name and the func keyword. Alright, sounds cool. That's how I'm gonna define it. Define Clojure for now. Again, it's a function without name and func keyword. We're gonna talk about. I'm gonna show you an example later. And why do you use Clojure? Well, for now, I'm just gonna say it's quick and easy to carry around as a variable, constant, or just pass as a parameter. Well, it may not make sense at this point, but we're gonna see all the examples and slowly why. But in this lesson, I'm going to talk about more about the how to use Clojure, not so much about the why we use it. The why part will be about when it comes to functional Swift. This is Intro to Functional Swift, but when it comes to functional Swift, you'll appreciate what a Clojure can do for you. So we talk about a lot of theory so far. So now let's learn how to use, and then maybe later lessons talk about why we use them, or you can slowly find out why Clojure is pretty good. So this is how you create a normal function to add two numbers, right? You have this to number 1 and number 2. It returns number 1 and 2. So simply you can use number 3, 30, and 30. Here we go. It's not a big issue, okay? But also, I'm not sure if you guys know this, know about that. You can also create a variable function. You can also add two numbers. And this time you're not calling it. You're simply assigning this func to add function. Okay, you're not running a function, you're just assigning to an add function variable. Assign it. Okay, so what's happening, you also have this magical ability to use this function like that. Okay, now it should work. It should be 30. Come on, it's running a little bit. 30 right there. Well, but what happened is this parameters, well, they're gone. Well, there's a Clojure thing going on, but we're going to come back hopefully later at the end of this lesson. Okay, so now let's learn how to do the same exact thing using closures, okay? So first of all, we want to create a variable, add Clojure, okay? Let's just call it add closures. And then what you want to do is you want to create a function like. So if you want to do that, you have to call equals, and you want to assign the Clojure block. Clojure is nothing more than just block here. And let's take a look at the example first. I think that's, first of all, you can do, let's define a Clojure block. And if you notice or now, if you take a look at add two numbers, there's a type for this function. And same thing applies to functions and closures. You have to define a type. So the type is, hey, you're going to enter parameter 1, you're going to enter parameter 2, and it's going to return int. Okay, that is a type of add to numbers. Same thing applies to add Clojure. You got to define a type. And this is just like the function. So all you're going to do is you're going to enter int, you're going to enter int, and you're going to enter int, okay? And you're going to return int, okay? Cool. But in this case, let's also define, so the type of this Clojure block. You're going to enter int, but you're going to also name the parameter just like number 1 and number 2. All right. When you're using function, you define the parameter here. But in Clojure, you can define the parameter right here. And you have to use the word int. sorry, you gotta do number 1 int, number 2 int, right there. And then here's a little trick. Return number 1 plus number 2. So what is in? What is in? Well, in is what separates from this is a parameter block, as well as this is a return block. This separates from the parameter block as well as return block. Okay, well, think about int. In is like the starting point of bracket in functions. It separates from the parameter blocks as well as the return block, and int separates from the parameter block as well as the return block. Okay, so now what's happening? You are able to call this add closures like that. Add closures, and you are able to add 2 numbers like that. 10 and 10. Sounds good. 20. Okay, so they look pretty identical, right? Again, why do I call a function? Why do I call closure as a function without name? Well, this is the closure block, right? This is a type definition. You're defining a type of variable, but in fact, this is the closure block. Okay, but let's try to remove this type. Do you think it's gonna work? Also works. Why is that so? Because you define a type. The type can be infer based on the parameter block. Parameter 1, parameter 2. They're int, and you're returning this int. The Swift is able to guess the type, infer the type of this closure block. So you don't have to specifically assign a type, but if you want to, you can do that. Okay, if you want to. Okay, I'm gonna give you one more, but there are many ways to write a closure block. This is quite verbose, right? Even if you do this way, this thing is quite verbose. Why do we even use closure when you can simply use function? There are many ways to write closure block, very simple and concise, and let's talk about that. First of all, right, add closure 2. We've done it before. You can simply we simply ignore the type because you're able to guess the type based on you're gonna enter number 1, number 2, and you return int. Okay, but you can also just simply, I like to use the word simply, may not come across as simple. You may also skip the return part because it allows to do that. It's because Swift is able to infer whenever you have number 1 and number plus number 2, you're able to infer that, hey, this thing must be returning. Because again, we said int is the one that separates from the parameter block. Okay, this is a closure. This is not. This is what I call a variable. You've assigned this closure block to a variable, but this part is a closure block. Okay, it's like a bracket closure bracket. So let's check if that works. You're able to run this closure block like that, number 10. Okay, but now here comes the magic. Well, we can make it even shorter. We can make it even so much concise than this way. How to do that? Well, there's a magic. There's magic to it. Actually, it's not a magic, but let's call it closure 4. And let's define the type in this case. And you'll find out why we define the type. Okay, cool. But here, all you're gonna do is type this money sign, $ plus $1. So what the heck is $0 and $1? Well, there is no parameter name to it, right? When you're running closure, there's no parameter name. No, even if you call number 1 as a parameter, then closure block simply states 4 and 6. Okay? So in this case, number 0 refers to number 1. The first parameter, number 1, $1 refers to the second parameter. So what's happening? You can do closure 4 and then simply run. I should stop using the word simply, right? It may not come across as simple like that. You're able to use 4 and 10. And 4 in this case refers to $0, and 10 refers to $1. Which same thing applies to different numbers. 10 and 15 should be 25 on the bottom right there for you guys. $25 right there. Cool. So now let's compare with the previous one. But wait, by the way, let's try to see if we can ignore this type, whether you can ignore. Well, I guess you have to define the type. If you're using $0, $0, well, you have to define the type. Okay, so when it comes to closure, if you remember the lesson 1, chapter 1, I like to go back. You have to define the type as well as you define the value. So when it comes to closure, same thing applies to that. So when it comes to function, same thing applies to that. So you might wonder, well, this is pretty concise compared to this. All right, this is pretty concise. So when you're working with somebody else, when it comes to function, when you're making a bunch of functions, you don't really need to know the parameter names sometimes. When it comes to, for example, let's say if the variable name is add 2 numbers, you don't really need to have parameter name number 1, number 2. That is not necessary. That means somebody else might come from different language background. Let's say you are speaking Korean, I'm speaking English. Well, that should not make sense. But anyway, so they don't really have to communicate with this number 1, number 2. These are a value name created by humans, right? That means somebody else has to interpret that that language. But when it comes to closures, as long as you define the variable with these names, you don't really have to define the parameters. Just call it int, and this is a universal name defined by the Swift language. This refers to first parameters, refers to second parameters, so nice and easy, so you don't have to do that. So when it comes to functional programming, we're going to take advantage of this universal language. But now, I just want to make sure that closure is nothing more than the name. There's no name to it. This is just a block of code. And also, there's no func keyword. And also, just quick and easy to carry around as a variable, right? You've learned how to carry around this closure block into a variable simply like that. And pass as a parameter. We'll learn about it in the next chapter. Pass as a parameter in the next chapter. Okay, so compare this. Let's see how many characters are there. Words 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and compared to this 3 lines. That's more than enough. So, but I'm going to show you a little more examples because I only cover one example at this time. How about with the type of you're not? So this type means you're entering nothing, but you're returning a string value. For example, this is the original func function, right? Well, how can you convert this into a closure block? Well, you can do. I'm gonna just type, even though some of you guys may not be familiar with the syntax, so I'm gonna type. So first of all, first thing first, let's define the type. All right, if you're not too familiar with the syntax, just define the type first, and then move on after. Here, but in this part, you also want to define the type of the parameter. But in this case, in the first example, we define the type here. But in this case, there's no parameter, so all you have to do is put right there, and then just write in. Separates the parameter block from the return part, and then we can say return hello, I'm a closure. Okay, let's find out if that works. Call string with closures, and now you're able to execute this closure block just like that. Let's see if that works. Hello, probably from closure. Hello, I'm from closure right there. Okay, but you can also, do like print something while you're calling this closure block if you want to. Hello, okay, and then you should print what you want to do on the bottom. But as you know, this is pretty long. You don't want to when you're using closure block. This rarely happens, especially when you're doing something simple. But when it comes to complex, yeah, you can do this. But this is a very simple example. But anyway, just wanted to go walk you through from how you can write a closure block to the simplest form ever you can do. You can also simply skip. Okay, I'm not gonna use the word simply anymore. You can also skip the word return unless you're not doing any other stuff, such as print hello. If you're using print hello, you're not allowed to. You have to use the word return. But if you're returning only one thing, Swift is smart enough to recognize, hey, you must be returning this hello, I'm a closure block right there. Smart, it's not smart. Swift is smart enough to recognize that this thing should return string without using the word return. Okay, there's also a shorter version. You can also call it, you don't even have to use the word in if there's no parameter. Again, if there's no parameter, remember this, when we come back to this again, if there's no parameter block, you can simply ignore this in and as well as this, the round brackets. Just simply say hello. Again, I use the word simply again. All right, you can, I should also avoid the word basically. It doesn't mean anything, right? You can also ignore the return part right there. Cool. And then lastly, it becomes so much simpler. Okay, that's not simply, but simpler, which is just simple. Okay, just use hello, I'm a closure. Why is that so? Because if you don't have parameter, you can just write it like this way. And Swift is smart enough to recognize that. Well, let's find out if Swift is able to recognize pickup right there. It takes no parameter, but returns something. So that's how you can write a closure block many ways. So some of you guys may feel overwhelmed by the information we learned in this case, but all I want to say is, hey, just make sure whether you're defining the type of a closure block, and then yeah, that's it. That's all you need to do. If you are confused, then just refer to this closure. You don't have to memorize anything. You don't have to memorize anything. Okay, memorization is not good. For me, when I teach this course, I don't memorize. I try to see, hey, is there a type for it? Can Swift able to infer the type? There we go. That's it. But if I wanna, but of course you gotta practice. Closures can be difficult, especially when you are not familiar with the syntax. But I just want to make sure that it's quick and easy if you're using it right. And then when it comes to the later part of the chapter, you will appreciate so much more. Just wait for that part, please. Okay? So see you guys in the next lesson. You'll learn about closure in the next part, next lesson as well. See you guys. To recap, you've learned that functions and closures are actually identical by its DNA. However, you may use closures in various forms that may lead to Zenness as well as effective communication. So far, you've only covered the very basics, but eventually you will learn the power of closure one step at a time. You may feel uncomfortable. In fact, if you've never seen it before, you should be. If you're not struggling, maybe you're not learning anything, because based on the thermodynamics law, the second, putting something into the brain, accumulating knowledge goes against the nature, right? So when you define nature, we humans suffer. So right now, yeah, definitely it's important and it's necessary for you to suffer, but it's okay. Eventually in the end, you will appreciate what you've suffered and you look back and like, wow, you've learned a lot from. In the next lesson, you will learn how to pass and return a closure block to a function. See you in the next lesson.